Very good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's uLaw webinar. I kindly request you to mute your phone lines and do dial in through your phone lines if possible into the webinar. If you are using the computer to dial in, again, kindly request you to mute your phone lines. Today's webinar is not accredited for any CPD credits. I want to make sure that that's upfront and honest about that. Our webinar for CPDs, actually we're starting the series from next week, so we do have a CPD session for all of you next week. And please do stay tuned by subscribing to our news channel, or you can actually look it up at uLawPractice.com/webinar. But today's particular webinar topic is going to be on context-sensitive data and the concept of additional parties and how using that data and in the context of where that data is required to be used, uLaw would then allow you to automate the filling of that data into the relevant forms. Within forms, obviously there are obviously client intake forms, there are file or matter related forms that you can be dealing with, or it could be court forms that we also automate. So we're going to kind of go through both file management or file-based forms as well as court-based forms, and how the data that you store within the uLawPractice product is then repurposed across all of these different silos. Okay, so again, the context-sensitive data, additional parties, and automated form filling is really the context and theme of today's webinar. Today's webinar is not accredited for CPD credits, but again, I'm hoping to walk you through the slides real quick, followed with a demonstration of how you would go about repurposing that data once filled across the product. Okay? So let's talk about what really is this data that you're storing. Fundamentally, if you look at data in uLaw, you have there's the contact information of different individuals or companies that you deal with. So really the people record of people that you deal with in your law firm or your legal firm. And this could be your client. This could be an opposing party. This could be the representative of the opposing party. This could be the context of joint retainership. So there's many different individuals or contacts or people information that you need to store so that you can repurpose that information across files, right? So that's one piece of information. The other piece of information is, or data, is once you have created a client, you obviously create the matter or the file for that client. And then what happens is really the context comes into play. So now you have all this data, that's fantastic, but what is the use of that data without the context? The context really is that particular joint retainer. Is he or she a joint retainer in this file, or is he or she a joint retainer in another file? Likewise, if you have an applicant, is that an applicant specific to this family law matter? Or if you have a contact who's an opposing party, is he or she a landlord, a tenant? What is the context of that individual with regards to a file? So that's really what we're considering as the context in which you're repurposing that data. Okay? So you have the people record, and then you have file records or the matter information, and then marrying these two together in a context-sensitive nature is truly accomplished using what we call as the additional parties within a file or a matter in uLaw. Okay? So we have this concept called additional parties. So once you create a client and you create a matter for that specific client, obviously you go through the process of creating a retainer letter, which also repurposes all of that data about that client and allows you to fill out retainer letter samples, different various samples of how you would go about doing that retainer. Could be hourly retainers, could be contingency, flat rate, simple, elaborate, right? So there's various different themes based on the nature of that particular file or the context of that particular file. Obviously, then you would go through the process of dealing with retainers, your dockets, your disbursements, and having to generate invoices. Now, each and every step of the way in these process, even when it comes to dockets and invoicing, there is the context of all the data or the people information that you need to repurpose. A very good example is if this is a joint retainer between two parties or multiple parties, then having all that information available in a retainer letter is very important. You can't just have a retainer letter for the primary applicant. The joint retainer's information technically needs to be part of that. Let's assume you're working for an enterprise. So you're a lawyer or legal professional and you have a corporate client. And but let's say the corporate client has asked you to send all invoices attention to a specific department or a specific individual. Okay? So there are nuances of what is the context in which that person's information is repurposed. That also comes into play when you generate invoices. Now, in the case of court forms, again, depending on the silo of practice, there are a few silos of practice that uLaw allows you to automate as much as possible. Some of the forms we automate up to about 95%. There are certain forms, obviously, there is about anywhere from 50 to 70%, but it still gives you a pretty much legway into automating these forms so that you can reduce the amount of manual effort. And where you see truly the value addition of the automation is when you have, unfortunately, or you have technically made a mistake and you have to correct that mistake. Without the automation, you technically would have to go into each of these forms, change them. If you're handwriting them, you have to reprint those forms, handwrite them again. Whereas with uLaw, what you could technically do is change the information in one place, and it automatically reflects wherever that particular data is being used. Okay? So additional parties not only applies to setting the relationship between those contacts or parties within the file, but it also sets the context of the relationship that each party has in the case of that file as well. So you may have multiple defendants, or in the case of an accident, if you're doing an accident benefit form, you may have multiple parties involved in that particular accident. You may have health practitioners who are required to be documented as individuals who have given you help during that accident. So there's different parties that could be involved in a particular file. So when you look at examples of forms, we've spoken about this briefly. Retainer letters, you could have the concept of joint retainers, client ID verification, or if you're doing a conflict screening report for the Law Society, then you can clearly outline the all of the conflicts that you may have with regards to any joint retainership, so that if you are now creating a new file for that same individual, then uLaw would track that as a potential conflict or inform you of that. Okay? And then from a court form perspective, we looked at it, right from small claims to landlord and tenant board to WSIB, accident benefits, family law, and criminal. These are some of the areas that we help with repurposing the contact information or the data that you've already stored, and then helping with automation of those forms. Okay? And obviously with regards to certain financial forms, such as Form 9A or the deposit slip or even the intramatter trust transfer, we help repurpose information. For example, in a Form 9A, I'm sure you're aware, the pieces of information that they ask for is, all right, what is the transaction number? What is the purpose of this particular form, right? What is this transaction from to? And they want to know the bank's information. So Form 9A is especially when you're doing a trust transfer through an electronic means, especially in the province of Ontario. So when you do that, there is a particular form that needs to be filled out for every time that you do an electronic fund transfer. And the pieces of information are very repetitive. They are, what is the trust account bank information? What's the address? What's the account number? And what is the to general account bank information? Okay? And we allow you to store that information once within uLaw, and then we automatically pre-populate that information for you in these forms as well. So now that I've set the context of what this particular webinar is going to focus upon, let me reiterate for those who just joined us that today's webinar is not accredited for any CPD credits, but our webinar next week does qualify you for 1 hour of CPD credits. And but today's demonstration is going to be all about context-specific data and how it's repurposed across various aspects of your practice management, right from your client intake to file management to court application forms to also financial management documents that are all required by our legal office to provide that holistic compliance package, if you will, to the Law Society as well as for your own purposes. Okay? So having set the context, so again, a few examples of additional parties. We've spoken about attention, where it's a great example where you have to if the attention needs to go to a specific department or an individual in a corporate company, applicant in the case of a family matter, you have child or child representative as well in the case of a divorce, or that's a great additional party context. In the case of a plaintiff-defendant situation, you have a small claims matter. You may have a situation where you're representing the plaintiff and you're capturing the information of the defendant. We spoke about the health practitioner, the insurance company when it comes to the case of, let's say, an accident benefit file. Invoice 2 is a very actually interesting context of an additional party. So in certain criminal matters, you may actually need to not necessarily hide, but actually redact the information of the client, and then the invoice needs to be sent to another party or a third party without the client information. So invoice 2 is a great example of how you can redact the client information and repurpose the invoice 2 information on that behalf. Joint retainers, as the name sounds, is when two parties or multiple parties are involved in a file. And in the case of landlord and tenant board, you have the two different parties. To answer a question that we've just received real quick, if there's a way to e-file a populated form, that is actually a great question. It is in our roadmap to do. Very few jurisdictions allow still the ability to file online forms, and we're working closely with some of those jurisdictions to pilot or a proof of concept so that it works well. So today we don't do that yet. But what we do know is that our clients, when they generate the court forms out of uLaw, obviously there's a definite review of the form. There's a few tweaks that have to be made to it, but it's almost ready to be then further manually. Even if it's manually done, there's a lot of time saved in e-filing that manually as well. But we are working towards automating that as well. But in today's context, we're not there yet. And again, we spoke about this. In fact, we have a very interesting video on our YouTube channel that really compares the time saving between filling forms the manual way and filling forms the uLaw way. And you can actually search that up on our YouTube channel under uLawPractice. Okay. From a court form perspective, small claims, landlord and tenant, POA, family, accident benefits, WSIB, criminal, and tribunals are some of the areas that we pre-populate these court forms. With respect to the landlord and tenant board, we are aware that some of the forms, especially L1 and L9s, have changed. We're actually working on that particular change, and that's what we do. As soon as there's a change in the form, we, depending on the complexity of the change, we take it as an SLA to revise it within our dictionary as well. Okay. Fantastic. So again, for those who joined us today who are not aware of who we are, we're again a Canadian legal accounting and practice management software company based out of Ottawa. We welcome you to the webinar, and if you want to learn more about us, kindly visit our website. We do offer a no obligation free 30-day trial that allows you to take our product for a test drive and really understand the depth and breadth of the product and if it can be a great fit for your firm. Okay? So as I mentioned earlier, today's webinar is, again, going to be one of those product demonstration webinars. We're going to first focus on the context-sensitive data, okay, and then how you repurpose that data once saved across the different facets of practice management or the life cycle of a particular client and his or her file. So one of the first steps that you would do in uLaw, again, regardless of whether you're repurposing this information or not, is you would do a client intake, right? That's part and parcel of a legal office is you accept that information. So let's do an add new contact, and they would add a new client. So let's say Mr. Random Names. You've got Mr. Burnaby. Okay, so again, from a data perspective, where we repurpose this in many reports and documents that are compliant ready, one such piece of information or sensitive data is the source of contact. Okay? The source of contact allows you to generate reports and dashboards that give you context into where you get your clients from. So let's say this was a walk-in. Someone just walked into your office and needed you to do, that's how they got to know you. But if this was a referral, or if this was a personal referral, a family referral, or even a marketing, AdWord, internet advertising, LinkedIn, you could actually use any of those. But in the purpose of this demonstration, let me just say it was a walk-in. Another context-sensitive data is address, because that obviously, apart from first name, last name, the address information is important when you do a conflict screening. Let's just go about it. And also, the Law Society needs you to capture a mailing address so that you can use that for correspondence. So all of the documents that you send out, it still needs to be referred to a mailing address. You can choose between multiple mailing addresses and choose one among them to be the primary mailing address. Okay. And of course, you can save phone numbers and emails, because today in the digital world, you may be sending invoices via email in an electronic format or other pieces of document in an email format as well. So it's obviously great and handy to save that information. Okay. Let me just go ahead and save this client as a contact. So that's data that you've now stored into uLaw, which is a cloud-based practice management software. Having saved that information, we're going to now walk you through some simple examples of documentation that's required, which needs data to be reported on, right? Where is this report or where is this document coming from? It's coming from the data that you've already saved. If you're not using a product, if you're not using software, then obviously you would have to repurpose, rewrite that information, or you may have an Excel sheet where you can copy paste. Regardless, all of these bells and whistles are meant to optimize your time and provide that productivity improvement that you deserve and expect out of the investment that you made in the product, right? That's the bottom line. So now that you've saved that information, you've saved it once, and that's effort and time spent once. And if you really start looking at the depth and breadth of all the reporting and documentation that can repurpose that data just from that contact information of a client, you'd be surprised. So very pragmatic pieces of documents. So an envelope. If you are a very busy firm that sends out a lot of mail, you can choose from different envelope types. Now, you may not want to write this information every time you generate an envelope. So the name, this is obviously very primitive. But regardless, it's a repurpose of information. You've got your logo, which was a one-time upload, is being repurposed. The information of Mr. Burnaby Dundas and the mailing address, one-time information, repurposed. You can do that for many different types of envelopes as well. Okay. Now, apart from that, you could have labels. Again, very primitive, but very pragmatic nevertheless. Very much compliant with the AV labels that your legal firm predominantly uses. You print this 100 copies, stick them upon the 100 envelopes that you have to send out. Okay, so it saves you a little bit of time, or your assistant's time, or your front office desk's time from having to type this every time. Okay, very simple, but yet effective, and again, trying to paint the picture and kind of prove a point. Now let's move on to, let's say, a compliant set of documents. So these are some of the Law Society's compliant documents for client management. Okay, so one such document is doing a quick conflict screening. So unless you've stored that information, it's hard for you to really understand if you've come across that individual, or if someone else in your firm can understand if there's a conflict in representing this individual. Okay, so how do you actually go about finding out that information, quickly investigating if there is a potential conflict in representing Mr. Burnaby Dundas? Okay, it's based on the context-sensitive data that's previously stored into uLaw. You know, uLaw, for example, searches, was there a first-name conflict? So have I ever dealt with an individual in my database whose first name is Burnaby? Have I ever dealt with an individual whose last name is Dundas? Now, we go even further to verify if you've come across this individual even in a different file. Okay? So if you really look at it, you've got Mr. Burnaby Dundas. And the only partial name that appears is that of Mr. John Duss Drunken Drive. So it took the URN, kind of sounds similar to that, right? But really there is no individual by the name Burnaby Dundas. But let me just, for the purposes of this demonstration, let me just show you how context-sensitive data works within uLaw. So I'm going to choose a client, a random client, let's say Mr. John Hopkins. Okay? Now let's say I add a docket, and I say meeting with a colleague. Okay? Let's say as a legal professional, you're doing this interview or having this meeting, let's just assume that Mr. John Hopkins met John, and let's say you actually docket that you did meet with Mr. Burnaby, and maybe Mr. Burnaby was a friend of John at that particular time, and maybe this happened, in the month of July. Okay, so this was actually a slip and fall. Maybe Mr. Burnaby was Mr. John's neighbor. Maybe you were investigating and then you met with Burnaby and he had some information to share. While you're at it, let me just go ahead and docket it too. Might as well, right? Let's say you spent an hour talking to Mr. John and Burnaby. Now this is data that's now saved. It's context-sensitive data because its context is that this was an individual information that's available in a docket in Mr. John Hopkins' file for a slip and fall matter. Okay. Now let me go back to my Burnaby Dundas. So let's say fast forward to today when I've done a client intake, or maybe the legal office, front office assistant was doing a client intake. One of the first things they would do is do a conflict screening. Now let's check all events and dockets, and that's really the essence of that. Check if you've ever created a matter for Mr. Burnaby Dundas, first name, last name. Go to the extent of even checking if I've come across that individual across all my events or dockets. And what you should expect, and I'm really hoping this works, is uLaw should now pick up that, this was the previous conflict screening, right? There's a potential name appears in this particular matter. It has nothing to do with Mr. John Hopkins' matter at all. What it should now technically pick up is the fact that you met with Mr. Burnaby and you spoke to him and that information was saved in that particular matter. Okay, so let's just give it a quick couple of seconds before it loads up that conflict screening report. And again, the matter being that of Mr. John Hopkins, slip and fall. That's actually JH59, whatever. And there you go. Now it's actually gone and searched the entire database, and it found out that actually, you know what, a partial name appears in an existing event. That may have been the case in John as well. You maybe put in as Burnaby or Dundas as part of that. There is a slip and fall matter. So your assistant or the front office person looks at it. The smart thing that they would do is actually go in, say, all right, perfect, I actually have a file number. So that's context-sensitive data right there. You have the information based on the data that's previously stored. The smartness to tell this assistant who never dealt with this matter or this client before, hey, just watch out, there's a partial name that seems to appear in this file. So the smart thing to do is go in a quick view, which kind of lists all the files, active, closed, archived, and basically search for that particular file. Or you can actually go into matters and actually put in that file number directly. But it has that, and you're like, John Hopkins, all right, let me further investigate. And then you jump into the matter, and you maybe browse through all the dockets, and you come across the name Burnaby. Now this is where the assistant is going to give the legal professional, Mr. Roger Moore, a call, just to further investigate what really happened. Here's one Mr. Burnaby who's come as a walk-in. Should I take him as a client or not? Right. So it starts as early as that is how context-sensitive data starts to work in your favor. And saving that information, repurposing that across all of those business lifecycle practice management guidelines is what uLaw does best. Right. So now that you've got that idea of how previously stored data is then used across the natural progression of your practice management stages, let's move on to the next logical step. Now let's assume the legal professional here, Mr. Roger Moore, says, you know what, go ahead. I don't believe there's a conflict. Let's go ahead and create a file for this individual. You're going to walk the next step, and that is creating a file for Mr. Burnaby, right? Again, there's a piece of information or data that's required that are sensitive to the context. And the context is, what is the area of practice that you're looking to start this new file? Okay? So let's start with a very simple small claims matter. And I'm going to say an issue with a neighbor. Perfect. Very simple piece of information that you've captured, but this data is relevant regardless. And we'll look at why it's relevant and in what context is it relevant in a few minutes. Perfect. So we've saved the simple information. We understand that Mr. Burnaby was a walk-in. We may have dealt with someone like Burnaby in the past, but that's been cleared after my conversation with, you can put that in the notes as well in the matter. Spoke to Roger, and there's no conflict, and hence created the file. That doesn't end with that. Okay, so you've done the due diligence that's required for the legal firm. Now, the law society expects you to document that as well. It expects you to document, to state in written form why you determined that this individual is not a conflict. So they actually have a very specific form that you need to fill out. So under document generation, in the context of the file, all you have to go into is the compliance, because that's really the guidelines for all of the relevant documents that auditors may be looking for. Obviously, one thing is you would right away check if this is truly Mr. Burnaby Dundas, right? So you would look at their driver's license or passport, whatever may be the information, you can actually pretty much click that right away. And you can see the data that you saved once is now repurposed for you to take advantage of. And you can obviously tweak this if you're not completely happy with the data. Again, this is not to take away 110% or 100% even the manual review that's required, but it's still essential to save you that 60 to 80% of heavy lifting of data repetitive tasks that you can otherwise use for other high-end events. Okay? So we didn't have a phone number, so obviously it's not filled out, but whatever information you had, it's done it. Obviously, you're going to amplify this information by adding more to it. How did you did you check your driver's license? Perfect. You can further supplement this document with a scanned copy of a driver's license if you feel. Okay? So here's your information, which may be repetitive in nature, and now it's being repurposed. You don't have to type it in again and again. It's just made as part of your signature. Yeah? That's one form. The other thing is a client intake form. So have you asked all of the relevant information to this particular client at the time of client intake? Right? That's a Law Society document as well. Have court proceedings commenced? No. What is the issue that you want legal representation for? Larger, more firm, all that information. Very important is the conflict screening report that I wanted to walk you through. So this conflict screening report really talks about, again, all the information repurposed. Is this a new client? Any conflict search information previously? No, we didn't find any, right? There's no conflict. Very important to declare that you did not decline a retainer, and obviously you did not refer them to another person. Okay? So right away, that single piece of information was now repurposed in its sensitiveness and in the context of how it was created and why it was created. And if you go back to our presentation, we spoke about retainer letters. Obviously, I didn't speak about all of this. I wanted to demonstrate it to you. But if you look at some of the forms, very important forms that really become part of that initial engagement with the client, that's a retainer letter. In generating it in MS Word, obviously, we give you the flexibility of tweaking it. So let's say a simple retainer letter. Traditionally, any letter pretty much has the context of what it's created for, the purpose, right? Be it an authorization letter, any other letter. Let me quickly open that up. I think it's still working behind the scene. Here's your retainer letter. We've captured that this was actually a neighbor issue because it really tells what is this context, right? You had captured that early on when you saved the title. It has the file number that was auto-generated, that's repurposed. Your data repurposed, your client's information repurposed, even to the extent of repurposing your rates and how much you charge, okay? Simple, something that you should expect out of many of the practice management products, but still relevant. If you're still doing the old school way, the manual way, this is something for you to, food for thought, for you to think about and move on to the other side, if you will, move into the dark side to start automating all of this information. Fantastic. So let's move on. So let's say, and this is a small claims matter, I wanted to introduce you to the context of additional parties. As we said, that's how you relate other parties or individuals through a relationship to this file, and that's the context in which they are related to Mr. Burnaby and this particular neighbor issue that he's having. Okay. Now let's assume Burnaby is the plaintiff in this case, so it's kind of important that you obviously appreciate some of that legal lingo. So in this case, let's say he is the plaintiff, the opponent party is the defendant. Obviously, adding that defendant information is important. Yeah? So let's go ahead and do that. But prior to that, it's important that information exists in the database, right? So you first need to have the data so that you can repurpose it. Now let's assume the neighbor and his name is what's a good name? Harry Potter. Okay, that's a good one. Thank you for that. Someone just texted Harry Potter. So let's go ahead and add a new contact. So now you're actually adding a name. Actually, I may already have Harry Potter. Pretty much search it up. Oh, there you go. I have a Harry Pottery. Let me say Ron Weasley. Okay, let's go ahead and add a new. And this time, this particular individual, Ron Weasley, he's not a client. He's not a ghost client. He's actually a plaintiff. No, he's a defendant. So you now try and classify or group him under contacts so that you can easily search on that information. You can basically see Mr. Ron. Okay. You really don't need to know the source of contact because that's more so from a client information perspective. We definitely need his address. Maybe he was 68 King Street. And that will be his mailing address. So now you have Mr. Ron Weasley's information saved into uLaw once. Okay? We'll just wait for that information to be saved as we refresh and bring out Mr. Ron's information. And let's now jump back into the matter that we were dealing with. All right, so that information is now saved. You go back into your matter and to the additional parties. And what's the first step you do is you actually add the relationship through that party. You say add party, and what's the relationship? You're going to say it's a defendant. So we give you the list of possible party relationships, and you can choose that. Let's say it's a defendant, and here's where you search for the information that you saved. And here is Mr. Ronald Weasley. And I hit save. So I'm basically saving Mr. Ronald Weasley as a party of a defendant in this particular matter. Okay? Now, maybe Ronald has a representative, his or her own paralegal or lawyer. That's a representative of the opponent. So let me search for Hermione Granger John. So I'm sure you're able to appreciate there's now 4 different contacts or people that are now related in this file. One is obviously yourself, Mr. Roger Moore, or the legal professional who I'm dealing with here. Mr. Roger Moore is the legal professional who's now representing his plaintiff, Mr. Burnaby Dundas. And now you have 2 other parties involved in this file. One is Mr. Ronald Weasley, who's the defendant, whose file is against, and Mr. Weasley's paralegal or lawyer, or what we call representative of the opponent, Ms. Hermione Granger. Okay. Obviously, it's a given, it's an assumption that Hermione's information was already available. And that's another beauty of the product, is if you do come across these very regular representatives, these are friends and colleagues that you come across all the time, obviously it makes sense to save that information one time so that you can repurpose that as easy as just associating them as a party, right? I'm just verifying if Hermione Granger actually has an address that I can deal with. There you go. Okay, she's at 71 King Street. Perfect. Now, having done all of this, let's try and keep this simple, and I'll spend the next 10 minutes walking you through some other use cases, okay? Document generation. We spoke about compliance. We looked at client verification, intake, conflict screening, retainer letter, all that good stuff. Right under the particular document generation, we'll also visit some letters that we can repurpose a lot of the information, okay? But let me go into my court forms just so I can highlight that. And we have right from small claims, landlord and tenant, to criminal and /2 and mortgage enforcement. Let me choose small claims court. And here are all of the typical court forms that you would come across that you would have to fill out. Technically, you would go about going to the individual court forms website, download the form, fill it out, and then file it. Again, no rocket science, but a little bit of a productivity toolkit is that we allow you to automate the filling of that information, just like how we did for all other types of legal documents. Okay? Let me do a plaintiff's claim. And let's say this was a courthouse in Toronto. Let's say this was Shepherd Avenue East. And I'll even say there's a claim number to make it interesting. The date, obviously whether the plaintiff is the creditor or the debtor, and you hit download. And what uLaw does is it has a repository or library of these court forms. And as I said, we do our best to update them as close as possible to any changes that have been reflected. We're certainly a little bit behind with the landlord and tenant board forms now, but we hope to have them available to you next week. But all the other forms are up to date and available in our library. Fantastic. So now what we've done is we've taken the court form, the individual court, right? Pre-populated that address. You didn't have to handwrite this or write this or type it. Got a claim number. It has some redundant pieces of data that we've extracted and infused it in a court form, keeping in mind the context of where that data needs to reside. Okay, so it didn't pick up a random information or random data, it didn't pick up a random contact and put it into this file. It picked up Mr. Burnaby Dundas, who's the client, who's the plaintiff here. He's number one. You could have multiple plaintiffs, multiple dependents, and we just add it under that as part of additional parties. His address, well, you can always, as I said, update this information. Okay? So let's say you've just got his phone number, right? This is, again, just to prove a point about the flexibility of utilizing a software, regardless of whether it's uLaw or not. In the case, uLaw allows you to update this information. So we did not capture his phone number at the time. Well, let's say he does give us the information. Instead of filling it out in that form, probably makes a lot of sense to actually fill it one time so it's available. And that's a good use case for any change that you come across in information, that you can save it once and repurpose it multiple different times. So, Mr. Dundas. Okay, let's edit his information one time, and let's say okay, and that's our phone number, by the way. So I've saved that information under Mr. Burnaby Dundas once. When I go back to that matter and now I regenerate that document, it's going to pick up that latest information. Same thing I could do for court file number. If I knew the court file number, I could fill it in here, and it would automatically populate 9876 in that particular context. Let me go ahead and hit document generation, forms, small claims, same thing. Choose Toronto, second floor address. It's pre-populated the claim number, and go ahead and download this document. And it's just a matter of seconds, right? So let me close out these documents. There you go. Got the phone number updated. You've got the legal professional who's representing Mr. Burnaby, Mr. Roger Moore, his information. Better, you've got the defendant's information, Mr. Ronald Weasley, his address. You've even got his representative, Harmonia's information. Okay? Obviously, there are a few additional things that you would have to fill out. Like, for example, how much is the principal amount claimed, right? You can even make this additional plaintiffs listed, under 18 years of age, the additional dependents attached, the date, right? And then to answer one of the questions, you review it, tweak it, add the missing information, and you're ready to file this. So this is an example of how data is used in its context and more beneficial in a life cycle of that particular client. Okay? So let's say we actually go about saying, finishing the file, small claims matter, and repurpose, and you make this a flat rate of $300. We obviously calculate what that billability should be. It should be $339, assuming you have the 13% tax. Go ahead and generate an invoice. Now this is another very important legal document, which needs to have all the relevant information. Information about yourself, needs to have information about your client, it needs information about the financial numbers, it needs to have information about what are your terms and policies for payments, which you can pre-populate, save that data, and repurpose. So if your terms are 30, you're going to repurpose that. Pretty straightforward. I mean, I'm sure you've come across this many times. So there you go. You've repurposed the information of your firm, the client. But let's say Mr. Burnaby comes about and says, actually, you know what? Can you address this or attention this to someone else? You're like, no worries. Additional parties, at a party, who should this be going to? He says it's got to go to Henry Peabody. Save that information once, you have it. Associate him has the attention, and regenerate that invoice. There you go. Mr. Burnaby done this, but it's attention Mr. Henry Peabody. Now this is very relevant if you're dealing, as I said, with corporate clients. If you're dealing with Rogers or Bell Communications and they say attention to Mr. Henry Peabody, it's a better context and it's a better use case to use that. But it's just a click of a button, you're able to repurpose that information in the context of this invoice. Yeah. But the slight difference between this and this with the click of a button. Now let's go with that amount, $339. That's all populated. Fantastic. Let's accept that client payment. I'll say, yeah, I've got that payment. You just paid me, gave me a check. Let's just do that. Now, if I receive this from someone else, I can actually create a receipt under that individual's name. Okay, so let's say Mr. Burnaby did not pay for this, and Mr. Henry paid for it. The receipt would then be made in his name, right? Makes more sense to do that. That's yet another legal document. A receipt is very important for you to produce so that you have a tab and a track of the exact payment received and a legal document that outlines that you have accepted it, right? You see, it now has Henry Peabody as the person who paid for that. Okay, so if you're curious about where is this piece of information being used, about it being a small claims, was it just in the title of the document? Well, it's not. When it comes to legal accounting, that same piece of information or data is then repurposed in uLaw from a financial standpoint as well. So if you want to know your fee book chart by category for the month of September, you can do so. Okay? And it tells you right away that the three piece areas of information that you made money on, so 28% came from small claims, right? And this particular small claims is a summation of all the revenue made under this particular data element or this particular area of practice. Okay? So let's say you want to know more. Let's say I want to know it by specifically today. There you go. Today, the only data entry that I have is 100% came from small claims. Where did that come from? Came from the 339 that we got. Okay, so if you want to know more, Mr. Burnaby Dundas is my only client for today, and he's the one who brought me the $339, right? So each and every piece of information that's stored in uLawPractice is then repurposed in some shape or form that's meaningful to you across the life cycle of your legal business. That truly is the underlying statement of today's webinar, is trying to be smarter, reducing the amount of time that you do for repetitive tasks, but also being smart in utilizing that data so that you can make better decisions to be more practical as well as profitable in your business. Okay? And there are various other examples, such as letters. Under the others, you have various other documents like business letter, client ID information, where you would start to appreciate how data is repurposed. But with another 5 minutes remaining, let me take an example of a client that I've already created for the purposes of this demo, just to show you some different samples and use cases and flavors of both court forms as well as other additional party examples. Okay? So let's say there's a rent eviction. So we look at a landlord and tenant board. So the client is Jonathan Form. Roger Moore is still the legal professional. The tenant in this case is Emma Brown, and her representative is Stefan Edberg. If you go into our landlord and tenant board, as I said, we definitely know that this is a form that needs to be changed, and we're actually changing it as we speak. It should be available with the most recent modified court form available to you next week. But click of a button, you should have that new form next week available to you with all the information pre-populated, such as the rental unit that's covered, the landlord's information, the tenant's information, her address, and finally the information about the representative who's representing the landlord here. Okay? So that's a simple landlord and tenant board example. I think this is just an example where Roger Moore is representing the tenant. So if you're looking at another form, could be a termination, could be any other document that's against the landlord, I guess. Let me take an example of POA. So let me say there's a POA. There's really no parties involved in a POA. It's just the client information. If I go into my POA form and let me the notice of intention to appear. This is a really commonly used form that people repurpose. Information available, that's pretty much it. Okay, what's a good example here? Family matter. So let's say this is a family law matter. You've got a respondent, they're representing multiple respondents, right, in a joint retainer situation. So in this case, let's say this is Jonathan and Emma is both the respondent and the joint retainer. When you go about actually generating, let's say, a retainer letter, right, you start noticing that the letters are now addressed not just to an individual, but to the two retainer relationships that there are in that particular file. If there are more, then there's more, so on and so forth. Okay? So little nuances here and there. And if you actually go about doing a form, I'm just going to do a family form in this matter. Oh, yeah. Do it 8A. And while we wait for, oh, there you go. Okay, so there's Mr. Jonathan Forms information, Roger Moore. You've got the respondent. You actually have a couple of respondents, both Emma Brown and Hudson Brown. And you've got Stefan Edberg, right? And the thing is, shouldn't have been Roger Moore, should have been someone else. But let's assume Roger Moore is representing Hudson Brown for Jonathan's purpose, right? That could be a case. Here's that document. So you've got the family law matter covered as well. Likewise, I think I've proved the point that data once stored into the product is then repurposed across, as I said, various other silos, including court forms, including other legal specific documents, including even financial documents. So I'll leave you with that one final document, which is a Form 9A, so that it shows you the depth and breadth of every life cycle that we touch. So it's not just client intake, file management. We also keep tab of that when it comes to Form 9As and those levels of financial documents. So how we store that information is under, obviously, the accounts that you have for your business. Okay, so under chart of accounts, let's say you have a trust account. We give you the opportunity to provide a nickname with your bank, and you don't even have to provide the full information. You can maybe just put the X's out and then actually have it for your general account as well. Okay, so it's 56786789. And let's say I go into a more recent file that I was dealing with. let's take that slip and fall from Mr. John Hopkins. Okay, and let's actually accept a retainer. So it's a trust transaction. I'm going to accept a retainer. And I'm going to say, he just gave me $113. That's a retainer. Give me a check. Okay. And let me go ahead and generate that invoice. Sorry, I won't take more than a couple of minutes now. I'll skip the preview, generate the invoice, just like how we did it the last time around when we accepted the payment. Just this time, we've gone through a trust transaction where you've accepted a retainer, you've done the work, generated the invoice, and now what's left to do is the trust transfer, right? So come into my trust tab. I'm actually withdrawing it from that. I'm saying trust invoice payment transfer. And this is where I can move the eligible $113 from my trust account into my general account. Okay, very straightforward. But in the province of Ontario, if you were to do this, okay, if you were to do that electronically, so let's say from one CIBC account to another electronically, if you use the electronic fund transfer, there's a Form 9A that you need to fill out. And we fill out that form as well. And what piece of information do they capture? What is the requisition number? Right? That's the reference number that the bank gave you for that transfer, the date that it when it happened. Very important for your reconciliation, because this date determines when the money left your trust account, right? And what is the debit account number? So what is the trust information? So you can always hide these numbers. If you need it, you can update them later. But this is the piece of information we had stored under chart of accounts for you to repurpose. So you don't have to type CIBC every time you do that electronic fund transfer. And we also give you the reason along with the invoice. Again, data that's very important because they do ask you for it. And the institutions. Okay? So to summarize through this webinar of how you manage context-sensitive data and through the association of the additional parties, we've kind of showcased how uLaw automates the data purpose or repurposing of data across all silos of practice management life cycles. Starting from your conflict screening, very important that you're able to search and scan through your entire database for an individual's name, to creating a file, to even recognizing the area of practice where you're making the revenue, to court forms, right, from small claims to criminal, as well as financial documents such as Form 9A. Okay? So once again, thank you for joining me in today's webinar. Please do send us your email to support@uLawPractice.com with any additional questions that you may have. Please do suggest other topics that you would like us to cover so that we can generate these little webinars for you. And I look forward to seeing you in our next webinar next week, which is actually a CPD session. Thank you once again, and have yourself a fantastic weekend.